The year 1990 began with a fragile sense of optimism. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall had fallen. For the first time in decades, it seemed possible that a new era of international cooperation was dawning. But in the deserts of the Middle East, a different kind of storm was gathering. A storm of ambition, debt, and grievance that would soon unleash a war of stunning speed and devastating consequence. This is the story of the Gulf War, a conflict that redrew the map of the Middle East and redefined modern warfare. The story begins in Iraq, a nation exhausted by 8 years of brutal war with its neighbor, Iran. The Iran-Iraq War had ended in a bloody stalemate in 1988. It had cost nearly 1 million lives and bankrupted both countries. Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, emerged from this conflict with a powerful and battle-hardened military. His army was one of the largest in the world. He possessed modern tanks, advanced aircraft, and a stockpile of chemical weapons. Saddam saw himself as the new leader of the Arab world, a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar. He believed his sacrifices in the war against Iran had protected the entire Arabian Peninsula. He expected gratitude. Instead, he got bills. Iraq owed massive debts to its Arab neighbors, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. These wealthy oil states had loaned Iraq billions of dollars to finance its war effort. Saddam considered these loans to be gifts. He had, in his view, spilled Iraqi blood to defend them from the threat of Iranian revolution. He believed his debts should be forgiven. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia disagreed. They wanted their money back. The dispute over these debts created deep resentment in Baghdad. Saddam felt betrayed by the very countries he believed he had saved. The financial pressure was compounded by a crisis in the oil markets. The price of oil was falling. This was disastrous for Iraq's war-torn economy. Saddam blamed Kuwait for the price drop. He accused the small emirate of overproducing oil, exceeding its OPEC quotas. This drove down prices and deprived Iraq of badly needed revenue. Saddam also accused Kuwait of stealing oil from the Rumaila oil field, which straddled the Iraq-Kuwait border. He claimed Kuwait was using slant drilling techniques to siphon off billions of dollars worth of Iraqi oil. These accusations were likely exaggerated, but they served Saddam's purposes. They allowed him to portray Kuwait as an aggressor, a wealthy and ungrateful neighbor sabotaging Iraq's recovery. The rhetoric from Baghdad grew increasingly hostile through the summer of 1990. Saddam massed troops on the Kuwaiti border. He demanded that Kuwait forgive Iraq's debt, pay reparations for the stolen oil, and cede control of strategic islands in the Persian Gulf. The demands were an ultimatum disguised as a negotiation. The world watched with growing concern. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis failed. Arab leaders tried to mediate, but could not bridge the gap between Saddam's demands and Kuwait's sovereignty. The United States sent mixed signals. On July 25, 1990, the American ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, met with Saddam Hussein. The exact content of their conversation remains controversial. According to the Iraqi transcript, Glaspie told Saddam that the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts like his border dispute with Kuwait. Saddam may have interpreted this as a green light for invasion. He may have believed the United States would not intervene to protect Kuwait. Whether this was a calculated misinterpretation or a genuine misunderstanding, it had catastrophic consequences. Saddam's decision was made. He would take Kuwait by force. He believed the world would protest, but ultimately accept the new reality. He believed the other Arab nations were too weak to oppose him. He was about to make the biggest gamble of his life. In the pre-dawn hours of August 2, 1990, the invasion began. Iraqi tanks and special forces crossed the border into Kuwait. The attack was swift and brutal. The small Kuwaiti army was no match for Iraq's massive military machine. Iraqi forces overwhelmed Kuwaiti defenses within hours. They raced toward Kuwait City, the capital. The Kuwaiti royal family, the Al-Sabah clan, fled to Saudi Arabia just ahead of the advancing Iraqi columns. By midday, Iraqi forces were in control of Kuwait City. They seized the airport, government buildings, and television stations. The invasion was a stunning military success, but it was a political and diplomatic disaster. The world woke up to the news that a sovereign nation had been swallowed whole by its larger neighbor. This was a blatant violation of international law, the kind of naked aggression the United Nations had been created to prevent. The international community's response was swift and unified. The United Nations Security Council met in emergency session on the day of the invasion. It passed Resolution 660, condemning the invasion and demanding Iraq's immediate and unconditional withdrawal. This was the first of many resolutions that would build a legal framework for international action. Sanctions were imposed, cutting off Iraq's trade with the outside world. Iraqi assets abroad were frozen. Saddam had expected a muted response. He got a chorus of international condemnation. The invasion created chaos and terror in Kuwait. Iraqi soldiers engaged in widespread looting. They stripped government buildings, hospitals, and private homes. Cars, electronics, and even gold fixtures were shipped back to Iraq. Iraqi forces committed numerous atrocities against the Kuwaiti population. Hundreds of Kuwaitis were arrested, tortured, and killed. A brutal occupation began. Those who could fled. Hundreds of thousands of Kuwaitis and foreign workers poured across the borders into Saudi Arabia and Jordan, creating a massive refugee crisis. The invasion also trapped thousands of Westerners in Kuwait and Iraq. Saddam declared these foreigners to be human shields. He moved them to strategic military and industrial sites. He believed their presence would deter Western airstrikes. This cynical use of civilians as pawns outraged the international community. It personalized the conflict for Western audiences. The fate of the hostages became a major political and media issue. Saddam's next move was to formally annex Kuwait. On August 8th, he declared Kuwait to be the 19th province of Iraq. He renamed Kuwait City as Al-Qadima. This was a clear signal that he had no intention of withdrawing. He was attempting to erase Kuwait from the map permanently. This act of annexation made a diplomatic solution even more difficult. It was a direct challenge to the international order. It was a line drawn in the sand that the world could not ignore. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush faced a crisis that would define his presidency. His initial response was cautious. But as the scale of the invasion and the brutality of the occupation became clear, his position hardened. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was visiting the United States at the time. She famously urged Bush not to go wobbly. Her advice reinforced Bush's own instincts. He began to see Saddam's aggression as a test of the post-Cold War world order. Bush's key advisors gathered to formulate a response. The team included Secretary of State James Baker, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell. They represented a range of views from cautious diplomacy to military action. The immediate concern was Saudi Arabia. With Kuwait occupied, Iraqi forces were now on the Saudi border. The vast Saudi oil fields were vulnerable. If Saddam invaded Saudi Arabia, he would control a huge percentage of the world's oil reserves. He would hold the global economy hostage. The decision was made to defend Saudi Arabia. On August 7th, President Bush announced the deployment of American troops to the kingdom. This was Operation Desert Shield. The first American forces, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, arrived in Saudi Arabia within days. Their initial mission was purely defensive. They were a tripwire force meant to deter further Iraqi aggression. But the deployment was the first step in a massive military buildup that would continue 4 months. Getting Saudi Arabia's permission for this deployment was a delicate diplomatic dance. King Fahd was deeply reluctant to allow foreign troops on Saudi soil. The presence of non-Muslim forces near Islam's holiest sites was politically explosive. The Bush administration sent a high-level delegation to Riyadh to persuade the king. They presented satellite imagery showing Iraqi forces massing on the border. They warned that Saudi Arabia was Saddam's next target. King Fahd, facing an existential threat, reluctantly agreed. The American deployment began. The logistical challenge of Operation Desert Shield was enormous. It was the largest and fastest military deployment since World War II. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and millions of tons of supplies had to be moved halfway around the world. Ports and air bases in Saudi Arabia operated 24 hours a day. The buildup was a testament to American military logistics and industrial power. By November, a formidable military force was in place. While the military buildup proceeded, Secretary of State James Baker launched a diplomatic offensive. His goal was to build the broadest possible international coalition against Iraq. This was a masterpiece of modern diplomacy. Baker traveled tirelessly, meeting with world leaders and foreign ministers. He secured support from traditional allies like Britain and France. He also brought in unlikely partners. Egypt and Syria, both major Arab powers, agreed to send troops to join the coalition. This was a crucial breakthrough. It showed that this was not a Western war against the Arab world, but an international response to aggression. Securing Soviet cooperation was another key objective. The Cold War was ending, but the Soviet Union was still a superpower. It had been Iraq's main arms supplier. Soviet opposition could have crippled the coalition. Baker worked closely with his Soviet counterpart, Edward Shevardnadze. The Soviets agreed to support UN resolutions condemning Iraq and imposing sanctions. They did not block the coalition's military preparations. This unprecedented U.S.-Soviet cooperation signaled a new era in international relations. By late 1990, the coalition was a remarkable assembly of nations. It included forces from the United States, Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and many other countries. 34 nations contributed troops or financial support. This was the broad international consensus Bush and Baker had sought. Saddam had expected to divide the world. Instead, he had united it against him. Saddam remained defiant despite international pressure and military buildup. He believed the coalition would not hold. He thought the American public would not support a protracted war. He believed he could absorb a first strike and inflict enough casualties to force a stalemate. He continued his brutal occupation of Kuwait. He held onto the Western hostages, parading them on Iraqi television in a clumsy propaganda move. He seemed oblivious to the growing danger he faced. In November 1990, the United States decided to double its forces in Saudi Arabia. This changed the mission from defensive to offensive. The force was now large enough to liberate Kuwait by force. The move signaled that the window for a diplomatic solution was closing. President Bush wanted to give diplomacy every chance to succeed, but he was also preparing for war. He believed that only a credible threat of force would convince Saddam to withdraw. The final step came at the United Nations. On November 29, 1990, the Security Council passed Resolution 678. This was the most important resolution of the crisis. It gave Iraq one final opportunity to comply with previous resolutions. It authorized member states to use all necessary means to liberate Kuwait if Iraq did not withdraw by January 15, 1991. This was a clear authorization for war. The deadline was set. The clock began ticking. The world held its breath, hoping for peace but preparing for war. The final weeks before the deadline were filled with frantic, last-ditch diplomatic efforts. Secretary of State Baker met with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz in Geneva. The meeting was tense and unproductive. Aziz refused to even accept a letter from President Bush to Saddam Hussein. Other leaders made pilgrimages to Baghdad to plead with Saddam. All failed. Saddam was convinced the coalition was bluffing. He believed America was a society that cannot accept 10,000 dead in one battle. He was tragically mistaken. As the January 15th deadline approached, the world braced for impact. The coalition forces were in place. The military plans were finalized. The political and legal justifications were established. The largest military alliance since World War II was poised to strike. In Kuwait, the resistance continued its desperate struggle against occupation. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein prepared for a war he believed he could win. On the deserts of Arabia, hundreds of thousands of young soldiers waited for the order that would send them into battle. The storm was about to break. The January 15th, 1991 deadline passed without Iraqi withdrawal. The world had given Saddam Hussein every opportunity to avoid war. He had refused everyone. The coalition was now authorized to act. Military commanders finalized their plans. Intelligence analysts studied their targets. Pilots reviewed their missions. Sailors prepared their ships. Soldiers checked their equipment. The waiting was almost over. What followed would become one of the most lopsided military campaigns in modern history. The air campaign began in the early morning hours of January 17, 1991. At precisely 2:38 a.m. local time, the first bombs fell on Baghdad. The operation was called Desert Storm. The opening strikes were carefully choreographed. American F-117 stealth fighters led the attack. These angular black aircraft were invisible to Iraqi radar. They carried precision-guided bombs directly to their targets. Command centers, air defense installations, and communications facilities were struck simultaneously. Saddam Hussein's ability to command and control his forces began to unravel from the very first minutes. The technology on display that night was unlike anything the world had seen before. Precision-guided munitions, called smart bombs, could be guided directly through specific windows of specific buildings. Television cameras mounted on the bombs transmitted images of the last seconds of their flights. These images were broadcast live on CNN. The world watched in real time as bombs flew down ventilation shafts and through doorways. Modern warfare seemed almost surgical, almost bloodless. This impression was partly false, but the technology was genuinely revolutionary. Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from American warships in the Persian Gulf streaked across the desert sky. Each missile followed a pre-programmed flight path, navigating by comparing the terrain below with stored maps. They flew hundreds of miles and struck within feet of their intended targets. Dozens of these missiles struck Baghdad simultaneously. The explosions lit the night sky over the Iraqi capital. CNN reporters Peter Arnate, Bernard Shaw, and John Holloman reported live from their hotel room as the city erupted around them. The initial strikes were devastating. Iraq's integrated air defense system was systematically destroyed. Radar installations were knocked out. Command and control facilities were demolished. Communications networks were severed. Saddam Hussein's ability to coordinate a response collapsed within hours. Iraqi fighter pilots took off to intercept the attack but were overwhelmed by coalition aircraft. Within the first few days, Iraqi aircraft stopped challenging coalition planes. The skies over Iraq and Kuwait became a coalition hunting ground. General Norman Schwarzkopf commanded the coalition military forces. He was a large, imposing man with a commanding presence and explosive temper. His troops called him Storming Norman. Schwarzkopf had served in Vietnam and was determined not to repeat that war's strategic mistakes. He planned a methodical air campaign that would systematically destroy Iraqi military power before committing ground forces. He rejected pressure for a quick ground offensive. He wanted the air campaign to do its work fully. The air campaign targeted Iraqi military capabilities methodically and comprehensively. In the first weeks, attacks focused on strategic targets. Airfields, air defense systems, command centers, and communications were priority targets. Nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons facilities were struck. Bridges and roads were destroyed to isolate Iraqi forces in Kuwait. Power stations were attacked, plunging much of Iraq into darkness. The campaign was designed to blind, deafen, and paralyze the Iraqi military machine. Coalition aircraft flew thousands of sorties daily. The numbers were staggering. Over the 43 days of the air campaign, coalition forces flew more than 100,000 combat sorties. They dropped over 88,000 tons of bombs. The variety of aircraft involved was impressive. American F-15 Eagles established air superiority. F-16 Fighting Falcons struck ground targets. F-111 bombers attacked hardened targets with precision weapons. Navy aircraft flew from carriers in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. British Tornadoes attacked Iraqi airfields with specialized weapons. Iraqi air defenses put up fierce resistance initially. Surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with fire. The coalition lost aircraft in these early raids. American, British, and other pilots were shot down and captured. Some were paraded on Iraqi television with visible bruises, suggesting they had been beaten. Others died when their aircraft were hit. Coalition losses were real and painful, but they were far smaller than the enormous damage being inflicted on Iraqi forces. Saddam Hussein responded to the air campaign in several ways. He began firing Scud ballistic missiles at Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Scud was an aging Soviet-designed missile with limited accuracy, but it was terrifying in its psychological impact. When Scuds began hitting Israeli cities, air raid sirens sent civilians scrambling for sealed rooms and gas masks. The fear of chemical warheads added to the panic. Saddam hoped the Scud attacks would draw Israel into the war. If Israel retaliated, Arab members of the coalition might withdraw in solidarity with the Palestinians. This was a cunning strategic calculation. The coalition worked desperately to keep Israel out of the war. President Bush called Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir personally. He urged restraint. He promised that coalition forces would make destroying the Scud launchers their top priority. American Patriot missile batteries were rushed to Israel to intercept incoming Scuds. The Patriots became symbols of coalition protection. Their intercept attempts were broadcast live on television. The images of missiles streaking through the night sky over Tel Aviv became some of the war's defining images. Israel showed remarkable restraint under enormous pressure. Israeli civilians endured Scud attacks without retaliating. Their restraint was a crucial contribution to keeping the coalition together. But the Patriot missiles proved less effective than their dramatic television appearances suggested. Later analysis showed the Patriots had a disappointing intercept rate. Many Scuds got through. They damaged buildings and killed civilians. But the damage was limited enough that Israel maintained its restraint. Coalition forces, particularly American Special Operations teams, hunted Scud launchers relentlessly. This became a major priority that consumed significant resources. The mobile Scud launchers were difficult to find and destroy. They fired their missiles and moved before aircraft could respond. Special Operations forces operated deep inside Iraq, searching for Scuds in the western desert. Satellite intelligence tracked heat signatures from Scud launches. Coalition aircraft raced to attack launchers before they moved. The Scud hunt became a war within a war. Inside Kuwait, the occupation had become a nightmare. Iraqi forces continued to loot and terrorize the population. The resistance fighters who had stayed behind reported on Iraqi movements and helped coalition pilots identify targets. Some were captured and executed. The bombing campaign strained the occupation forces. Supply lines were being cut. Food and ammunition became scarce. Iraqi soldiers, far from home and under constant bombardment, began to suffer from severe morale problems. Saddam made a surprise move in mid-January. He sent most of the Iraqi Air Force to Iran. Hundreds of aircraft, including advanced fighters and bombers, flew across the border to safety. This was a puzzling decision. The aircraft sat out the rest of the war in Iran and were never returned. The move removed these assets from the battle but preserved them from coalition attacks. Saddam may have been planning for a long war, or he may have simply been saving assets for future use. Whatever the reason, the coalition air campaign now faced reduced opposition. The ground war question was debated intensely within the coalition. General Schwarzkopf wanted more time for the air campaign to degrade Iraqi ground forces. He estimated that destroying 50% of Iraqi armor and artillery would make the ground campaign feasible with acceptable casualties. Military planners had initially estimated that liberating Kuwait could cost tens of thousands of coalition casualties. Some estimates were even higher. The air campaign was working to reduce these casualty projections. The initial ground war plan had been relatively simple. Coalition forces would attack Iraqi positions in Kuwait frontally. This followed the most direct route to liberating the occupied emirate. But Schwarzkopf was unhappy with this plan. It was too predictable. It played into Iraqi strengths by attacking prepared defensive positions frontally. The Iraqis had spent months building elaborate defenses. They had laid extensive minefields, dug trenches, and built berms. A direct assault would be costly. The revised plan was far more ambitious and creative. Schwarzkopf called it the left hook. Coalition forces along the coast would feint toward Kuwait's beaches, simulating an amphibious landing. Forces facing the Iraqi lines in southern Kuwait would make limited attacks to fix Iraqi troops in place. Meanwhile, a massive armored force would swing far to the west, deep into the Iraqi desert. This force would then turn east, sweeping behind the Iraqi forces in Kuwait and cutting off their line of retreat. It was a classic encirclement maneuver on an enormous scale. To execute this plan, Schwarzkopf moved the equivalent of 2 army corps hundreds of miles to the west, in secret and in a matter of weeks. The logistics of this movement were extraordinary. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, fuel trucks, and supply vehicles moved through the desert at night. The movement was concealed from Iraqi intelligence. Coalition deception operations fed false information to the Iraqis. They believed the main attack would come along the coast. They had no idea that the largest armored force assembled since World War II was assembling in the desert to their west. The air campaign's second phase focused on Iraqi ground forces in Kuwait and southern Iraq. B-52 bombers flew from bases in England, Spain, and Diego Garcia, dropping enormous loads of bombs on Iraqi troop positions. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who survived B-52 raids described the earth shaking for miles around. Many were buried alive in their bunkers. Others were driven to the edge of sanity by the constant bombardment. Iraqi troops began surrendering in small groups. The coalition's leaflet drops telling Iraqi soldiers how to surrender found a receptive audience. The Iraqi defensive system in Kuwait was called the Saddam Line. It was an impressive engineering achievement. Multiple belts of obstacles stretched along the Kuwaiti border with Saudi Arabia. These included extensive minefields, both anti-tank and anti-personnel. Berms of sand and concrete obstacles blocked tank movement. Trenches filled with oil were designed to be lit on fire, creating walls of flame. Behind these obstacles, Iraqi artillery was positioned to fire on any attacking force. Machine gun nests and infantry positions completed the defensive complex. Behind the Saddam line, the Republican Guard waited. These were Iraq's elite forces, personally loyal to Saddam Hussein. They were better equipped, better trained, and better paid than regular Iraqi army units. The Republican Guard comprised several armored and mechanized divisions. They were equipped with Soviet T-72 tanks, the best armor in the Iraqi arsenal. They were positioned to deliver the decisive counterattack when coalition forces had been worn down by the Saddam line's defenses. Saddam's plan was for the Republican Guard to be his ace in the hole. The air campaign continued to pound Iraqi forces relentlessly. Thermal imaging from aircraft could detect Iraqi vehicles and equipment, even when camouflaged. Precision weapons destroyed individual tanks and artillery pieces from the air. Supply convoys were attacked, ammunition dumps were destroyed, fuel supplies were disrupted. The Iraqi military machine was slowly being starved of the resources it needed. Morale among Iraqi conscripts plummeted with each passing day. Intelligence reports from inside Kuwait were encouraging. The resistance reported that Iraqi forces were suffering from serious supply shortages. Desertion rates were climbing. Iraqi soldiers were scavenging for food. The months of air bombardment were having a profound effect. The elaborate defensive system Saddam had built was being degraded systematically. Coalition commanders grew more confident about the ground campaign. The casualty projections continued to fall. Political pressure for a ground offensive mounted. The air campaign had been running for nearly 6 weeks. Saddam was still in power. Iraqi forces still occupied Kuwait. The international patience was not unlimited. Arab members of the coalition wanted results. The American public supported the war but wanted it ended quickly. President Bush authorized the ground campaign. A final date was set. After 6 weeks of air campaign, the ground assault would begin. Saddam attempted last-minute diplomatic initiatives to avoid a ground war. He announced a unilateral withdrawal from Kuwait, but attached conditions that were unacceptable to the coalition. The withdrawal would be conditional on Israel withdrawing from the occupied territories and coalition forces withdrawing from the region. Bush and the coalition rejected these conditions. They demanded unconditional withdrawal. The Iraqi offer was seen as a cynical delaying tactic. The night before the ground offensive, coalition aircraft flew their most intensive bombing missions yet. They struck Iraqi positions across the front. They dropped fuel-air explosives, called daisy cutters, to clear minefields. They fired thousands of artillery rounds in preparation for the assault. Inside Kuwait, the fires from sabotaged oil wells cast an eerie orange glow over the desert. Saddam had ordered his forces to set Kuwait's oil wells on fire. Hundreds of wells burned, creating a massive environmental catastrophe. The fires could be seen from space. The sky above Kuwait turned black. On the ground, hundreds of thousands of coalition troops prepared to move. American, British, French, Saudi, Egyptian, and other soldiers made final preparations. They wrote letters home. They checked their weapons and equipment one last time. Many were frightened. The Iraqi army was large and experienced. Its chemical weapons capability was real and terrifying. American soldiers had been issued atropine injectors and chemical protection suits. They had practiced donning them in seconds. The fear of chemical attack was constant. The commanders gave their final orders. The logistics were in place. The intelligence picture was as complete as it could be. The deception operations had succeeded. Iraqi commanders still believed the main attack would come along the coast. The western flank was essentially unguarded. The coalition's massive armored force waited in the desert, engines running, ready to move. The moment the coalition had been building toward for 6 months was about to arrive. The ground war was about to begin. The mood in Washington was tense. President Bush and his national security team gathered in the Oval Office as the hour approached. Around the world, television cameras focused on the empty Kuwait desert. Military correspondents reported breathlessly from their positions near the front. In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein was reportedly underground in a secure bunker. In Kuwait, the resistance waited anxiously for liberation. In Saudi Arabia, hundreds of thousands of soldiers waited for the order to advance. The 100-hour ground war was about to begin. At 4 a.m. on February 24, 1991, the ground war began. The sky over the Saudi Arabian desert was black and silent. Hundreds of thousands of coalition soldiers lay in their defensive positions, waiting for the order. Then, without warning, the desert erupted. Artillery batteries opened fire simultaneously along the entire front. The roar was deafening. It rolled across the sand like thunder that would not stop. Thousands of cannons and howitzers fired at once. The ground shook. The noise traveled for miles. Iraqi soldiers in their bunkers clamped their hands over their ears and prayed. The first phase of the ground assault was a feint exactly as General Schwarzkopf had planned. Coalition forces along the Persian Gulf Coast made limited attacks toward Kuwait's beaches. They simulated an amphibious landing. They fired artillery, conducted probing attacks, and created the impression of a major assault coming from the sea. Iraqi commanders, convinced the main attack would come from the coast, shifted forces to meet this threat. They reinforced beach defenses. They moved reserves toward the shoreline. They did not notice the real attack forming in the desert to their west. While the coast feigned an invasion, the main coalition force moved. The left hook was in motion. The largest armored force assembled since World War II was on the move. More than 350,000 troops, 1,800 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces, and 1,100 aircraft were advancing across the featureless desert. The convoy stretched 400s of miles. Tank tracks carved new roads through the sand. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and supply vehicles followed in endless columns. The movement was so vast it could be seen from space. American satellites and spy planes watched but reported nothing unusual. The deception had worked perfectly. The spearhead of this massive force was the 7th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Frederick Franks. The 7th Corps consisted of the 1st Infantry Division, the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions, and numerous supporting units. They were supported by British, French, and other coalition forces. Their objective was to swing far to the west through the Wadi al-Batin corridor along the Iraq-Kuwait border. Then they would turn east and drive deep into Iraq, behind the Iraqi forces defending Kuwait. The terrain they crossed was harsh and unforgiving. The desert offered no cover, no landmarks, and no mercy. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night and soared during the day. Sandstorms reduced visibility to near zero. Equipment broke down constantly. Engines overheated. Tracks snapped. Fuel pumps failed. Mechanics worked around the clock to keep the machines moving. But the force kept advancing. Nothing could stop it. On the second day of the ground war, February 25th, the coalition force struck. They burst out of the Wadi al-Batin corridor and turned eastward into Iraq. The first major engagement came at the Battle of Wadi al-Batin. Iraqi border units, caught completely by surprise, offered little resistance. Many surrendered immediately. Others fled into the desert. The coalition's advance was so rapid that Iraqi commanders could not react in time. The encirclement was beginning to close. As the coalition armored columns drove east, they encountered the first organized Iraqi resistance. Iraqi units along the border tried to block the advance. They deployed tanks and artillery in defensive positions. But the coalition's air power had already devastated their communications and supply lines. Iraqi commanders could not coordinate their defenses. Air strikes hit Iraqi positions before they could engage the advancing armor. Precision-guided bombs destroyed command posts, artillery batteries, and ammunition dumps. Iraqi units were isolated and overwhelmed. The Battle of Phase Line Bullet on February 26 demonstrated the coalition's overwhelming advantage. Iraqi armored units attempted to counterattack the advancing the 7th Corps. They launched their tanks in a desperate attempt to stop the encirclement. But coalition aircraft were waiting in the skies above. A 10 Thunderbolts, a Warthog ground attack aircraft, flying at treetop level, shredded Iraqi armor with their 30mm cannons. Apache attack helicopters fired Hellfire missiles with devastating accuracy. Iraqi tanks burned in the desert like torches. The counterattacks collapsed within hours. The speed of the coalition advance was breathtaking. The 7th Corps advanced nearly 200 miles in just 2 days. Iraqi forces in Kuwait found themselves cut off from any possibility of retreat. They were trapped between the advancing coalition forces to the west and the defending coalition forces to the east. The encirclement was complete. The Iraqi army in Kuwait was about to be destroyed. While the 7th Corps executed the left hook, other coalition forces attacked along the front. The Arab members of the coalition, particularly the Saudi Arabian and Egyptian forces, conducted supporting attacks to fix Iraqi troops in place. These attacks were real and bloody, but they were designed to hold Iraqi forces in Kuwait rather than achieve deep penetrations. The main destruction was happening in the west, where the 7th Corps was sweeping around behind the Iraqi lines. On February 27th, the coalition forces entered Kuwait. The liberation of the emirate began. Coalition armor rolled through the border checkpoints without resistance. Iraqi soldiers, demoralized by months of air bombardment and facing certain defeat, were surrendering in droves. Thousands of Iraqi troops threw down their weapons and raised their hands. They stood in the desert waiting for coalition forces to collect them. The surrender was so massive it overwhelmed the coalition's capture and processing capabilities. Kuwait City was liberated that same day. The first coalition troops to enter the capital were Kuwaiti resistance fighters, many of whom had been fighting the occupation for months. They drove through the streets in pickup trucks and civilian cars, firing their weapons in the air and cheering. The mood was euphoric. After 7 months of brutal occupation, Kuwait was free. But the city they entered was a wasteland. The Iraqi occupation forces had systematically destroyed Kuwait. They had set fire to hundreds of Kuwait's oil wells. The fires burned for months, creating a massive environmental disaster. The sky above Kuwait turned black with smoke. The air was thick with toxic fumes. Day became night. The temperature dropped as the sun's heat was blocked. The oil fires were visible from space. They became one of the most recognizable images of the war. Iraqi soldiers had also looted everything they could carry. Government buildings, hospitals, schools, and private homes had been stripped bare. Desks were empty, safes were open. Even light fixtures and plumbing had been removed. The systematic looting was a deliberate policy of economic destruction. Saddam Hussein wanted to leave Kuwait a broken, impoverished shell. He nearly succeeded, but the liberation of Kuwait was not the end of the ground war. The coalition's mission was not just to free an occupied country. It was to destroy Iraq's military capability and prevent future aggression. The left hook continued to drive deep into Iraq. The 7th Corps advanced toward Basra, Iraq's second-largest city. The objective was to cut off Iraqi forces in Kuwait and destroy the Republican Guard. The Republican Guard was Saddam Hussein's elite force, his personal army. These were Iraq's best troops, equipped with the latest Soviet T-72 tanks and supported by artillery and mobile infantry. Saddam had positioned the Republican Guard to deliver a decisive counterattack against coalition forces. He believed they would stop the invasion and restore the situation. The air campaign had weakened them, but they were still formidable. On February 28th, the coalition forces encountered the Republican Guard in force. The Battle of Medina Ridge became one of the war's most significant engagements. The 7th Corps attacked the Talwalkalna Division of the Republican Guard. The battle was a one-sided slaughter. Coalition aircraft, artillery, and tanks destroyed Republican Guard units with devastating efficiency. The elite Iraqi forces, supposed to be Saddam's trump card, were annihilated. The destruction was complete and brutal. American tanks engaged T-72s at ranges where the Iraqi tanks had no chance of hitting back. Hellfire missiles from Apaches found their targets with unerring accuracy. Fuel-air explosives created massive blast waves that killed soldiers in their bunkers. The ground shook from the explosions. The desert was littered with burning vehicles and charred bodies. The Republican Guard, the pride of the Iraqi military, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Other elements of the Republican Guard were also destroyed. The Hammurabi Division and the Medina Division suffered similar fates. Iraqi officers who had been confident of victory hours earlier found themselves fleeing for their lives. The myth of Iraqi military invincibility was shattered. The coalition had not just won a battle, it had won a war. As the Republican Guard collapsed, Iraqi forces across southern Iraq began to disintegrate. Regular army units that had been holding defensive positions simply stopped fighting. Many surrendered, others abandoned their equipment and fled north. The Iraqi military, which had seemed so formidable just days earlier, dissolved into chaos. The 100-hour ground war was proving to be exactly that, a lightning campaign that ended in stunning victory. But the speed of the coalition advance created problems. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were in short supply. Some coalition units had to pause their advance because they were running out of gasoline. The desert swallowed vehicles and equipment. Broken down tanks and trucks lined the roads. Mechanics worked frantically to keep the remaining machines moving. The logistical miracle that had brought the force to the Middle East was now being tested under combat conditions. The coalition's rules of engagement were designed to minimize civilian casualties and avoid unnecessary escalation. But they also limited the coalition's ability to pursue retreating Iraqi forces. Iraqi troops could surrender by waving white flags or driving out of their vehicles with their hands raised. Coalition aircraft and artillery would cease fire when these surrender signals were observed. This saved lives on both sides, but it also allowed large numbers of Iraqi soldiers to escape. As coalition forces advanced toward Basra, political considerations began to intrude. President Bush and his advisors were concerned about pushing too deep into Iraq. They feared that destroying Iraq's army completely could destabilize the entire region. They worried about the humanitarian consequences of advancing into densely populated areas. They were also mindful of the need to maintain the fragile coalition. Arab members, particularly Syria and Egypt, might not support an invasion of Iraq itself. The decision was made to halt the coalition advance near the Iraq-Kuwait border and around Basra. The 7th Corps stopped short of entering Iraqi territory in force. This decision would be debated for years. Critics argued that allowing Iraqi forces to escape intact allowed Saddam Hussein to remain in power. They believed the war should have been pushed to its logical conclusion. Supporters argued that stopping short prevented a wider regional war and maintained the coalition. On March 1, 1991, the ground war officially ended. The 100 hours of combat had achieved the coalition's objectives. Kuwait was liberated, the Iraqi military had been shattered, Saddam Hussein's ability to threaten his neighbors had been destroyed. The war that had begun with the invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990, was over. The Lightning Campaign had taken just 43 days from the start of the air war to the end of the ground war. The human cost of the ground war, while far smaller than that of the air campaign or the Iran-Iraq war, was still real and tragic. Coalition forces suffered approximately 148 combat deaths during the ground war. Another 458 were wounded. These were the young men and women who had come halfway around the world to defend a small Arab emirate. They had done their duty with professionalism and courage. Their families received the news that their loved ones had come home, but not in the way anyone wanted. Iraqi casualties were enormous. Estimates of Iraqi military dead range from 25,000 to 100,000. Another 75,000 to 100,000 were wounded. Over 70,000 Iraqi soldiers were captured. The Republican Guard, Iraq's elite force, was essentially destroyed. The regular Iraqi army had disintegrated. Saddam Hussein's military machine had been shattered beyond repair. The dictator who had believed he could defeat the world had been decisively defeated by it. The civilian cost in Kuwait was catastrophic. The environmental damage from the oil fires was unprecedented. Hundreds of oil wells burned for months. The smoke and soot blackened the sky. Toxic fumes poisoned the air. The oil slicks contaminated the Persian Gulf. The fires released massive amounts of carbon dioxide and other pollutants. The environmental cleanup would take years and cost billions of dollars. The scars on the landscape would remain for decades. The human suffering was equally devastating. Thousands of Kuwaitis who had disappeared during the occupation were never found. Mass graves were discovered after liberation. The extent of Iraqi atrocities became clear only after the war. Torture chambers were found. Execution sites were uncovered. The systematic looting had destroyed the Kuwaiti economy. Rebuilding would take years. The trauma of occupation would affect Kuwaiti society for generations. In Iraq, the war's aftermath was even more tragic. The coalition's bombing campaign had destroyed much of Iraq's infrastructure. Power plants, water treatment facilities, bridges, and roads were damaged or destroyed. The humanitarian situation deteriorated rapidly. Sanctions imposed after the war prevented Iraq from importing food, medicine, and spare parts. Child mortality rates soared, diseases that had been controlled before the war returned. The Iraqi people suffered enormously for the sins of their leader. Saddam Hussein remained in power despite his catastrophic defeat. The coalition had achieved its military objectives, but not its political ones. Saddam had been contained, but not removed. He had been punished, but not broken. He would remain in power for another 12 years, until the 2003 US-led invasion finally toppled his regime. The unfinished business of the Gulf War would continue to shape the Middle East for another decade. The psychological impact of the war was profound. The world had watched the conflict unfold in real time on television. CNN broadcasts brought the war into living rooms around the globe. People watched precision bombs strike their targets and Scud missiles explode in Israeli cities. They saw the liberation of Kuwait and the suffering of its people. The Gulf War was the first television war. It changed how future conflicts would be covered and understood. For the soldiers who fought, the war created bonds that would last a lifetime. They had trained together, fought together, and won together. They had seen the technology of modern warfare in action. They had witnessed the speed and decisiveness of coalition victory. Many returned home changed men and women. They had been part of something historic. They had helped defend the principles of international law and sovereignty. They had proven that a united international community could confront aggression successfully. The coalition's victory in the Gulf War seems to mark the triumph of the New World Order that President Bush had spoken about. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The United States stood as the world's sole superpower. Aggression could be confronted and defeated. International law could be enforced. The post-Cold War era seemed destined for peace and cooperation, but this optimism would prove premature. The very success of the Gulf War would create new challenges and new conflicts in the years to come, as the last coalition troops withdrew from Saudi Arabia in 1991. The desert returned to its ancient silence. The oil fires in Kuwait were finally extinguished. The smoke cleared. The landscape began the long process of healing. But the political and strategic landscape of the Middle East had been permanently altered. Kuwait was free. Iraq was weakened but not broken. The United States had demonstrated its ability to project overwhelming military power across the globe. The world would never be the same. The euphoria of coalition victory faded quickly. The guns had fallen silent. Kuwait had been liberated. But the aftermath of the Gulf War created new crises that would define the Middle East for decades. The war had solved one problem while creating several others. Saddam Hussein was still in power. Iraq was devastated but unrepentant. The region was unstable and volatile. The victory that had seemed so complete and decisive was revealing itself to be something far more complicated. The most immediate crisis came from within Iraq itself. Saddam Hussein had been humiliated and defeated. But he was still alive and still in control of significant military forces. The Republican Guard had been shattered but not completely destroyed. Enough units survived to give Saddam the means to maintain power. Coalition forces had stopped their advance short of Baghdad. This decision, which seemed prudent at the time, now had terrible consequences for millions of Iraqis who had hoped for liberation. President Bush had called on the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. His words were heard and acted upon. Within days of the ceasefire, uprisings erupted across Iraq. The Shia Muslim majority in southern Iraq rose against Saddam's Sunni-dominated regime. In the north, the Kurdish population seized the opportunity to fight for autonomy and independence. Cities across Iraq fell to rebel forces. Basra, Najaf, Karbala, and dozens of smaller cities were captured by opposition fighters. For a brief moment, Saddam's regime seemed genuinely on the verge of collapse, but the coalition did not support the uprisings. American forces sat on the Iraqi border and watched as Saddam's surviving forces crushed the rebellions. Republican Guard units used helicopter gunships, artillery, and tanks against poorly armed rebels. The brutality was savage and indiscriminate. In Basra, government forces shelled residential neighborhoods. In Karbala, one of Shia Islam's holiest cities, forces loyal to Saddam desecrated mosques and executed clerics. Thousands of rebels and civilians were killed. Mass executions occurred. Bodies were left in the streets as warnings. The coalition's failure to support the uprisings haunts American foreign policy to this day. The reasons for non-intervention were complex. Bush administration officials feared that Iraq would break apart without Saddam. They worried about Iranian influence over Iraq's Shia population. They believed a fragmented Iraq would create a power vacuum that destabilized the entire region. Arab coalition members were deeply uncomfortable with the prospect of regime change. Saudi Arabia and Egypt had no desire to see a Shia government in Baghdad. The realpolitik calculation was cold and brutal. The uprisings were allowed to fail. Saddam Hussein survived. He took terrible revenge on those who had risen against him. Thousands were executed. Mass graves were dug across southern Iraq. The southern marshes, home to the Marsh Arabs for thousands of years, were deliberately drained to deny sanctuary to rebels. One of the world's most ancient and unique ecosystems was destroyed. The Marsh Arabs, a people with a culture stretching back to ancient Sumeria, were displaced and scattered. In the north, the Kurdish uprising also collapsed. Saddam's forces swept through Kurdish territory with brutal efficiency. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds fled toward the mountains on the Turkish and Iranian borders. They fled in winter through mountain passes without food, shelter, or medical care. Thousands died of exposure, hunger, and disease. Television cameras captured the human tragedy. Columns of desperate people struggling through snow-covered mountain passes shocked the world. The Kurdish refugee crisis forced the international community to act. Coalition forces established a safe haven in northern Iraq to protect the Kurds. Operation Provide Comfort deployed American, British, and French troops to northern Iraq. They created a protected zone where Kurds could return and rebuild their lives. American aircraft patrolled the skies above the zone, enforcing a no-fly zone that prevented Iraqi military aircraft from operating. This was the first of several no-fly zones that would shape the post-war situation. The no-fly zones became a permanent feature of post-war Iraq. A southern no-fly zone was established to protect the Shia population. American and British aircraft patrolled these zones for 12 years, from 1991 to 2003. They flew hundreds of thousands of sorties. They engaged Iraqi air defenses regularly. Iraqi forces fired at coalition aircraft repeatedly. Coalition aircraft struck Iraqi military installations in response. This low-level conflict continued almost daily for over a decade. It was a war in slow motion that received relatively little media attention. The sanctions imposed on Iraq after the war were meant to pressure Saddam into complying with UN resolutions. Iraq was required to destroy all weapons of mass destruction. International inspectors were to verify this disarmament. Iraq was prevented from importing weapons. Revenues from oil sales were controlled under the Oil for Food program. The sanctions were comprehensive and severe. They were intended to squeeze Saddam's regime until it complied. The sanctions had devastating humanitarian consequences. The Iraqi middle class was destroyed. Inflation wiped out savings. Professional salaries became worthless. Doctors, engineers, and teachers left the country in large numbers. The brain drain was catastrophic. Medical supplies were restricted. Hospitals operated without basic medicines and equipment. The infant mortality rate doubled. Child malnutrition became widespread. The United Nations estimated that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died as a result of sanctions-related deprivation. Saddam Hussein exploited the sanctions for his own purposes. He maintained his palaces and his security apparatus while his people suffered. He diverted funds from the Oil for Food program through corrupt arrangements with foreign companies and governments. The UN Oil for Food program was itself riddled with corruption. Investigations later revealed that Saddam had bribed officials and business people in dozens of countries. The sanctions hurt ordinary Iraqis while Saddam and his cronies lived in luxury. The inspection regime created constant confrontation. UN weapons inspectors tried to access Iraqi military facilities. Saddam's government played a cat-and-mouse game. They allowed inspectors limited access while hiding prohibited programs. They expelled inspectors when searches got too close to sensitive sites. They filed false declarations about weapons programs. The confrontation between Iraq and the inspectors became a defining feature of the 1990s. Each crisis brought threats of military action and then uneasy standoffs. Rolfi Koos and then Richard Butler led the UN Special Commission charged with disarming Iraq. Both men faced constant obstruction from Iraqi authorities. Inspectors were denied access to presidential palaces. Documents were hidden or destroyed. Iraqi officials lied and dissembled. The inspectors discovered evidence of massive biological, chemical, and nuclear programs. They found weapons stockpiles that Iraq had not declared. Each discovery triggered new confrontations. The cat-and-mouse game continued year after year. The relationship between the United States and Iraq deteriorated through the 1990s. Saddam Hussein repeatedly challenged the no-fly zones and defied UN inspectors. The Clinton administration responded with periodic military strikes. Operation Desert Fox in December 1998 was a 4-day bombing campaign against Iraqi military facilities. The campaign was intended to degrade Iraq's weapons programs and punish continued obstruction of inspectors. After Desert Fox, Iraq expelled all UN weapons inspectors. The inspection regime collapsed. The Gulf War's political legacy in the Arab world was complex and contradictory. The war had demonstrated that Arab states could not defend themselves without Western help. This dependence was humiliating. The presence of American troops on Saudi soil near Islam's holiest cities generated deep resentment. Islamic extremists pointed to this presence as proof of American crusader intentions. Osama bin Laden, a Saudi national who had fought in Afghanistan, made the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia a primary grievance. The Gulf War contributed directly to the radicalization that led to the September 11th attacks. The Palestinian issue complicated Arab reactions to the war. Yasser Arafat and the Palestine Liberation Organization had expressed sympathy for Iraq during the crisis. This was a catastrophic political miscalculation. The Gulf monarchies cut off funding to the Palestinians in retaliation. Jordan, which had also tilted toward Iraq, was ostracized by its Gulf neighbors. The war reshuffled regional alliances and loyalties. Old relationships were broken and new ones formed. The political map of the Arab world was redrawn. Kuwait's liberation had profound consequences for the emirate. The country had been devastated by occupation and war. The immediate task was reconstruction. The oil fires, which burned for 9 months before being extinguished, had caused enormous environmental and economic damage. Oil production had to be restored. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt. The psychological wounds of occupation had to be addressed. Kuwait spent billions of dollars on reconstruction. American, British, and other companies won lucrative contracts. The emirate recovered remarkably quickly. The Gulf War transformed American military doctrine. The stunning victory confirmed the value of technological superiority and precision warfare. The concept of the revolution in military affairs gained currency. American defense planners believed that advanced technology, precision weapons, and superior intelligence would allow smaller forces to defeat much larger enemies. This thinking influenced military planning throughout the 1990s. Defense budgets were restructured around these concepts. The emphasis shifted from mass to precision and from numbers to technology. The success of coalition air power reshaped how military planners viewed the relationship between air and ground forces. Air power advocates argued that the air campaign had done most of the work in destroying Iraqi military power. They claimed that the ground war was merely cleanup after air power had done the decisive damage. This argument was exaggerated but influential. The Air Force used Gulf War success to argue for greater resources and independence. The debate about the relative roles of air and ground power continued for decades. The role of Special Operations Forces expanded dramatically. The Scud Hunt in western Iraq had demonstrated the value of small, elite teams operating deep behind enemy lines. Intelligence gathering, target identification, and direct action missions had all contributed to coalition success. After the Gulf War, investment in special operations capabilities increased. The Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and other elite units received more funding, better equipment, and greater importance in military planning. This expansion of special operations capability would shape subsequent conflicts. The Gulf War also transformed media coverage of conflict. The Pentagon's media management during the war was sophisticated and effective. Journalists were embedded with coalition units or briefed at carefully managed press conferences. General Schwarzkopf's press briefings were master classes in media management. He used video footage of precision strikes to emphasize coalition accuracy and minimize footage of civilian casualties. The briefings were widely broadcast and shaped public perception of the war, but the media coverage also created unrealistic expectations. The sanitized images of precision strikes created the impression of a clean, surgical war. The reality of civilian casualties and battlefield carnage was largely hidden. Future military operations would struggle with the gap between media management and battlefield reality. The Gulf War established precedents for media management that shaped how subsequent conflicts were presented to the public. The environmental consequences of the war were severe and long-lasting. The oil fires in Kuwait burned for 9 months. Before they were extinguished, they released more oil than any previous man-made environmental disaster. The smoke and soot affected air quality across the region. The oil lakes created by wells that burned at ground level contaminated the desert. The Persian Gulf was polluted by deliberate oil releases intended to complicate coalition operations. The environmental damage was incalculable. The health consequences for veterans became a major issue in subsequent years. Gulf War syndrome affected tens of thousands of veterans. They suffered from a range of symptoms including chronic fatigue, muscle pain, cognitive difficulties, and skin disorders. The causes of Gulf War syndrome were debated. Some researchers pointed to exposure to depleted uranium used in coalition tank ammunition. Others cited the smoke from oil fires. Still others suggested reactions to multiple vaccinations given to soldiers. The debate continues, but the suffering of affected veterans is undeniable. Depleted uranium ammunition was used extensively by coalition forces. American tanks fired rounds tipped with depleted uranium, a byproduct of nuclear fuel processing. These rounds were extraordinarily effective at penetrating Iraqi tank armor. They burned through steel like a hot knife through butter. But depleted uranium left radioactive contamination at impact sites. Iraqi soldiers and civilians living near these sites may have been exposed. Elevated cancer rates in some areas of Iraq have been linked to depleted uranium contamination. The evidence is contested, but the concern is real. The prisoners of war issue added to post-war complications. Coalition POWs were released quickly after the ceasefire. Most had been in Iraqi captivity for only a short period. Some showed signs of mistreatment. American pilot Jeffrey Zahn appeared on Iraqi television with visible bruises on his face. The Geneva Convention protections for POWs had clearly been violated. But the quick release of coalition prisoners meant that POW treatment was a relatively minor issue in the war's aftermath. Iraqi POWs presented different challenges. The coalition had captured tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers. They had to be housed, fed, and eventually repatriated. This was a massive logistical undertaking. Saudi Arabia constructed large prisoner of war camps. The conditions were generally adequate, though not luxurious. The repatriation of Iraqi POWs was eventually completed, but the process highlighted the enormous scale of Iraqi military collapse. The financial cost of the Gulf War was extraordinary, but largely borne by others. The United States spent approximately $61 billion on the conflict, but much of this was paid by coalition partners. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Japan, Germany, and other allies contributed heavily. The total coalition contribution to U.S. costs was approximately $54 billion. This meant the war was largely paid for by those who benefited from it. The financial burden on American taxpayers was relatively modest compared to later conflicts. The political legacy of the Gulf War shaped American politics throughout the 1990s. President Bush's approval rating soared to over 90% in the immediate aftermath of victory. He seemed unbeatable in the 1992 presidential election. But the economy deteriorated through 1991 and 1992. Bush was perceived as more interested in foreign policy than domestic concerns. His challenger, Arkansas's Governor Bill Clinton, focused relentlessly on economic issues. Clinton won the 1992 election. The hero of the Gulf War was ousted by a candidate who had never served in the military. The Gulf War left a complex legacy for American foreign policy. It demonstrated that the United States could lead broad international coalitions and achieve decisive military victories. But it also raised questions about what those victories could actually achieve. The war had been fought with clearly defined, limited objectives. It had achieved those objectives, but the aftermath was messy and unresolved. The lessons about the dangers of undefined objectives and open-ended commitments would be painfully learned in subsequent conflicts. The regional balance of power was permanently altered by the Gulf War. Iraq, once the dominant military power in the Arab world, had been reduced to a weakened, isolated state. Iran, which had watched the Gulf War from the sidelines, emerged as the dominant power in the region. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies became even more dependent on American military protection. The regional architecture that had existed before the war was gone. A new structure was emerging, one that would be defined by American dominance and Iranian ambition. The war's impact on oil markets was significant, but ultimately manageable. The disruption of Kuwaiti and Iraqi oil production had initially threatened global supplies. Saudi Arabia and other producers had compensated by increasing output. After the war, Kuwaiti production was gradually restored. Iraqi production remained restricted by sanctions. The global oil market adjusted, prices stabilized. The feared energy crisis never fully materialized. But the vulnerability of Gulf oil supplies had been demonstrated once again. This shaped energy policy in consuming countries for years. The military hardware used in the Gulf War provided a comprehensive test of weapons systems developed during the Cold War. The M1 Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the F-117 stealth fighter, the Patriot missile system, and many other systems were tested in combat for the first time. Some performed brilliantly. The Abrams tank proved virtually invincible against Iraqi armor. The F-117 demonstrated the value of stealth technology. Others performed less well than expected. The Patriot missile's intercept rate was far lower than initially claimed. Each system's performance informed future procurement and development decisions. The Gulf War fundamentally changed the relationship between the United States and the Middle East. America had demonstrated its willingness and ability to project massive military power into the region. This had both positive and negative consequences. On the positive side, it deterred future aggression by regional powers. On the negative side, it created resentment among populations who saw the American military presence as an affront to Arab dignity and Islamic values. This resentment would fuel the extremist movements that attacked America on September 11, 2001. The children who watched the Gulf War on television in 1991 grew up in its shadow. Many Americans who later served in the 2003 Iraq War remembered watching Desert Storm as children. They had grown up with images of coalition aircraft sweeping through Iraqi skies and tanks racing across desert sand. They had been told that America could achieve swift, decisive victory through technological superiority. These expectations would collide painfully with the reality of the 2003 invasion and its aftermath. The Gulf War's legacy shaped the generation that fought the next war in Iraq. The Gulf War's shadow stretched far beyond the desert battlefields of 1991. Its consequences rippled outward across decades, reshaping the Middle East and the world in ways that few anticipated. The conflict had been won decisively on the battlefield. But the political, social, and strategic consequences proved far more difficult to manage. The war's legacy was not a simple story of triumph. It was a complex, often tragic tale of unintended consequences and missed opportunities. The most direct consequence of the Gulf War was the continuation of Saddam Hussein's brutal regime. The decision to halt the coalition advance and allow Saddam to survive was made with rational intentions. But its human cost was incalculable. For 12 more years, Saddam ruled Iraq through terror and repression. His secret police, the Mukhabarat, monitored every aspect of Iraqi life. Dissidents were arrested, tortured, and executed. Entire communities were punished for suspected disloyalty. The Iraqi people paid an enormous price for their government's aggression. The sanctions regime imposed after the war created a humanitarian catastrophe. The Oil for Food program was intended to allow Iraq to sell limited amounts of oil to purchase food and medicine. But the program was poorly designed and riddled with corruption. Saddam manipulated it skillfully. He maintained his military and security apparatus while blaming the West for his people's suffering. He used the humanitarian crisis as a propaganda weapon. He portrayed the suffering of Iraqi children as the result of American cruelty rather than his own misrule. The suffering was real regardless of its cause. Iraqi children died from preventable diseases. Hospitals operated without basic medications. Malnutrition affected significant portions of the population. The middle class was destroyed. Professionals who had built Iraq's modern infrastructure emigrated in large numbers. The country that had been one of the Arab world's most developed before the wars was rapidly becoming one of its most impoverished. The combination of war, sanctions, and misrule was destroying Iraq from within. Osama bin Laden watched the Gulf War with fury and determination. The presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, the guardian of Islam's holiest cities, was intolerable to him. He had offered to defend Saudi Arabia with his Afghan Arab fighters, the veterans of the jihad against the Soviet Union. His offer was rejected. The Saudi government chose American troops over bin Laden's warriors. This rejection and the ongoing American military presence became a central grievance in bin Laden's ideology. Al-Qaeda, the organization bin Laden built in the aftermath of the Afghan jihad, identified America as its primary enemy. The Gulf War presence of American forces in Saudi Arabia was listed as one of the primary justifications for attacking America. Bin Laden issued a fatwa in 1996 declaring war on America. He issued another in 1998, calling on Muslims to kill Americans wherever they found them. The terrorist attacks that followed, culminating in September 11, 2001, were direct consequences of the Gulf War's strategic choices. The September 11th attacks transformed the strategic landscape entirely. America's response was to invade Afghanistan and destroy Al-Qaeda's base there. But the Bush administration also turned its attention to Iraq. The case for war against Iraq was built on the argument that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. This claim drew directly from the Gulf War experience. The inspections regime had found evidence of massive weapons programs in the 1990s. Intelligence agencies believed those programs had continued after inspectors were expelled. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was in many ways the unfinished business of the Gulf War. President George W. Bush and his advisors believed they were completing what his father had left undone. They would remove Saddam Hussein from power and establish a democratic Iraq as a model for the Arab world. The military campaign was swift and decisive. Coalition forces reached Baghdad in just 3 weeks. Saddam Hussein's statue was pulled down in Firdos Square. The imagery recalled the liberation of Kuwait 12 years earlier, but the aftermath was nothing like the Gulf War's clean resolution. The invasion of Iraq unleashed forces that could not be controlled. The Iraqi state collapsed. Ethnic and sectarian tensions exploded. The Sunni minority, which had dominated under Saddam, faced Shia retribution. Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged from the chaos. A brutal insurgency began that cost thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. The Iraq War became everything the Gulf War had not been: a protracted, costly, and deeply divisive conflict. The weapons of mass destruction that justified the invasion were never found. The intelligence had been wrong. The confidence that had been built from Gulf War-era inspections proved misplaced. Saddam had apparently dismantled his weapons programs after the Gulf War under international pressure, but he had maintained ambiguity about their existence to deter his regional enemies, particularly Iran. This deliberate ambiguity proved fatal to his regime. It provided the justification for the invasion that killed him and destroyed his country. Iran was the Gulf War's ultimate strategic winner. The conflict removed its two main threats simultaneously. Saddam Hussein's military had been shattered by the coalition in 1991. The subsequent sanctions regime prevented Iraq from rebuilding its military power. Then the 2003 invasion removed Saddam entirely. Iran's most dangerous adversary was gone. Iraq, which had fought Iran for 8 years, was now governed by Shia parties with close ties to Tehran. Iran's sphere of influence expanded dramatically into a country it had failed to conquer militarily. The Shia crescent that Iran's enemies had warned about became reality. Iranian influence extended from Tehran through Baghdad and Damascus to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iraqi Shia militias trained and equipped by Iran became powerful political and military forces. The strategic balance that the Gulf War had been intended to maintain was fundamentally altered. The unintended consequence of two American wars in Iraq was the dramatic expansion of Iranian power. This was precisely the outcome that Gulf War planners had sought to prevent. Saudi Arabia watched these developments with growing alarm. The kingdom had spent billions of dollars supporting the Gulf War coalition. It had allowed foreign troops on its soil despite the political and religious costs. It had hoped that American power would maintain regional stability and contain both Iraq and Iran. Instead, the fall of Saddam had empowered Iran. The American military presence, which had seemed protective in 1991, now seemed to have created more problems than it solved. Saudi anxieties about Iran would shape regional politics for decades. The Gulf War's impact on Arab politics was profound and lasting. The war exposed the weakness and dependence of Arab governments. Despite their oil wealth, they could not defend themselves without Western help. This humiliation fueled various forms of radicalism and reaction. Some Arabs turned to political Islam as an alternative to discredited nationalist regimes. Others embraced conspiracy theories that blamed Western powers for Arab weakness. The intellectual and political ferment unleashed by the Gulf War contributed to the conditions that produced the Arab Spring 2 decades later. The Arab Spring of 2011 swept through the region with stunning speed. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain all experienced massive popular uprisings. The protesters demanded dignity, democracy, and economic opportunity. The uprisings had many causes, but the Gulf War's legacy was among them. The discrediting of Arab nationalist regimes, the demonstration of Arab military weakness, and the continued humiliation of foreign dependence all contributed to the anger that exploded in 2011. The Gulf War had not directly caused the Arab Spring, but it had helped create the conditions for it. The military technology demonstrated in the Gulf War continued to evolve and spread. Precision-guided munitions became standard in all major militaries. Stealth technology was developed further. Satellite communications and navigation transformed military operations. Unmanned aerial vehicles, rudimentary in 1991, became sophisticated weapons systems. The information warfare capabilities demonstrated in the Gulf War became central to military planning. The revolution in military affairs that the Gulf War had seemed to inaugurate continued to develop and transform warfare. The coalition's success in the Gulf War created a template that was frequently invoked but rarely replicated. The broad international coalition, the clear mandate, the limited objectives, and the decisive military campaigns seemed like a model for future interventions. But these conditions were exceptional rather than typical. They depended on Saddam's unusually blatant aggression, the Cold War's ending, and exceptional diplomatic skill. Subsequent crises rarely offered the same favorable conditions. The Gulf War template was repeatedly misapplied to very different situations. The role of the United Nations in authorizing the Gulf War was significant but ambiguous in its lessons. The Security Council had authorized military action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. This gave the coalition legal legitimacy. It was the first time since the Korean War that the UN had authorized major military action. But the precedent proved difficult to replicate. In subsequent crises, including Kosovo in 1999 and Iraq in 2003, Security Council authorization was either not sought or not obtained. The Gulf War's UN authorization was the exception rather than the rule. The veterans of the Gulf War carried their experiences into subsequent roles. Many became senior military officers who shaped American strategy in later conflicts. General David Petraeus, who played a major role in the Iraq War, had served as a staff officer in the Gulf War. Many other Gulf War veterans rose to senior positions. Their experiences of swift coalition victory influenced their thinking. Some drew appropriate lessons about the limits of military power. Others drew inappropriate lessons about the ease of military success. Their varied interpretations shaped subsequent American military decisions. The Kuwaiti people built a new relationship with their history after liberation. The occupation had been traumatic. The brutality of Iraqi forces had left deep scars. Memorial sites were established. The National Museum preserved artifacts from the occupation period. Books, films, and testimonies documented the suffering. Kuwaiti identity was reshaped by the experience of occupation and liberation. The small emirate had nearly ceased to exist. Its survival created a powerful sense of national identity that had not previously existed with the same intensity. Kuwait's political system evolved after the war. The Al Sabah royal family had made promises of political reform during the occupation. After liberation, they were pressured to honor those promises. The National Assembly was strengthened. Women eventually gained the right to vote in 2005. Civil society became more active. The oil-rich emirate remained an absolute monarchy in important ways. But the Gulf War experience pushed it toward greater political openness. The process was slow and incomplete, but real. The environmental legacy of the war continues to this day. The Kuwaiti desert bears the scars of the oil fires. Oil lakes that formed from burning wells at ground level left permanent contamination. Heavy metals and hydrocarbons poison the soil. Recovery has been slow and incomplete. The Persian Gulf ecosystem suffered from massive oil releases during the conflict. Marine life was severely damaged. Recovery has occurred, but the Gulf's ecosystem remains fragile. The environmental consequences of the war provide a sobering reminder of warfare's long-term costs. The Gulf War's lessons about coalition building remain relevant. Bush and Baker's diplomatic achievement in assembling a 34-nation coalition was remarkable. It required enormous energy, skill, and compromise. It depended on shared interests and clear objectives. The coalition held together because every member had something to gain from Iraqi defeat. The diplomacy that made this possible demonstrated what international cooperation could achieve when conditions were right. This achievement has been studied by diplomats and scholars ever since. The contrast between the Gulf War coalition and subsequent American military ventures is striking. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was conducted by a much smaller coalition, dismissively called a coalition of the willing. The absence of broad international support undermined the legitimacy of that intervention. The contrast highlighted how exceptional the Gulf War coalition had been. Bush Sr. and Baker had understood that legitimacy mattered as much as military power. Their successors forgot this lesson with catastrophic consequences. The human stories of the Gulf War deserve remembrance alongside the strategic analysis. The young American soldier from rural Iowa who had never been outside his home state suddenly transported to the Arabian desert. The Kuwaiti woman who hid her neighbors from Iraqi patrols for 7 months of occupation. The Iraqi conscript who had no choice but to fight for a regime he hated. The Saudi family that watched foreign troops march through their neighborhood with mixed feelings of relief and resentment. These human stories give the war its true meaning. The soldiers who fought the Gulf War were part of the most professional military force America had ever fielded. The all-volunteer army that replaced the draft after Vietnam had been built and trained for this kind of conflict. They were better educated, better trained, and better equipped than any previous American force. They performed with extraordinary skill and professionalism. Their victory was a testament to the investment America had made in its military over the previous decade. They deserved the parades and celebrations that greeted them on their return. The African American soldiers who fought in the Gulf War did so in a military that was far more integrated than the force that had fought in Vietnam. African Americans served at all ranks and in all specialties. General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was the most senior military officer in the country. His face was as familiar to Americans as any battlefield commander. The Gulf War was in this sense a more equal war than its predecessors. But the racial tensions that had marked American society did not disappear. They merely expressed themselves differently. Women served in the Gulf War in greater numbers and closer to combat than in any previous American conflict. Female soldiers drove supply trucks, flew helicopters, maintained aircraft, and performed countless other essential functions. Some were killed, some were taken prisoner. Their service demonstrated that gender was not a barrier to military effectiveness. But the rules that kept women from formal combat roles remained. The Gulf War accelerated the debate about women in combat that would continue for decades. The full integration of women into all military roles came later, but had its roots in the Gulf War experience. The prisoners of war returned from the Gulf War told stories that became part of the conflict's legend. Rhonda Cornum, an Army flight surgeon, was captured when her helicopter was shot down. She was injured, assaulted, and held as a prisoner. She returned home and wrote about her experience with remarkable composure and courage. Her story exemplified the experiences of women in the conflict zone. It contributed to the ongoing debate about women in combat. She later rose to the rank of Brigadier General. The families of those who did not return carried their grief into the decades that followed. The 148 Americans killed in the ground war left behind parents, spouses, and children. The additional Americans who died in accidents, illness, and other non-combat causes added to this toll. These families built a community of shared loss. They established memorials, foundations, and support networks. They lobbied for recognition of Gulf War syndrome. Their advocacy ensured that the Gulf War's human cost remained part of the public record. The Gulf War's final legacy is perhaps the most important and the most difficult to assess. The war demonstrated both the power and the limits of American leadership. America could lead a broad coalition and achieve decisive military victory. It demonstrated extraordinary diplomatic and military skill. But military victory could not guarantee political success. The war solved one problem while creating others. It removed Iraq as a threat while empowering Iran. It demonstrated American power while generating resentment that fueled terrorism. The world that emerged from the Gulf War was different from what anyone had anticipated. Bush's New World Order, in which international law would be enforced by collective action, proved elusive. The 1990s were filled with conflicts in Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Kosovo that tested and often overwhelmed international capacity to respond. The cooperative spirit of the Gulf War coalition proved difficult to sustain. Nations returned to pursuing their individual interests. The promise of collective security remained unfulfilled. The Gulf War stands as one of modern history's most consequential conflicts. It was brief, but its echoes are still reverberating. It was decisive militarily, but ambiguous strategically. It liberated a small country while destabilizing a large region. It demonstrated American power at its peak while planting the seeds of challenges that would test that power severely. It united the world briefly and then watched as that unity dissolved. It was a war that seemed to answer every question it raised while actually raising more questions than it answered. We stand today more than 3 decades removed from the 100 hours of ground combat that liberated Kuwait. The veterans of that conflict are in their 50s and 60s. The world they fought in is largely gone. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Saddam Hussein was executed in 2006. Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011. The region they fought to stabilize remains unstable. The international order they defended remains contested. But the human courage, sacrifice, and determination they showed remain an inspiration. They answered their country's call. They fought with skill and professionalism. They won a remarkable victory. The Gulf War's true meaning lies not in the statistics of bombs dropped and tanks destroyed. It lies in the human stories of courage and sacrifice, of liberation and loss, of hope and disillusionment. It lies in the lessons learned and the lessons ignored. It lies in the connections between that conflict and the world we inhabit today. Understanding the Gulf War is essential to understanding our present. Its shadows fall across every major challenge in the Middle East. Its lessons, both heeded and forgotten, continue to shape decisions about war and peace.